Of all the wars the United States has involved itself with, very few have ended in what we consider losses. One of the most notable examples of such a conflict is the Vietnam War, considered to be the height of U.S. involvement in proxy fighting during the Cold War. Ultimately, it has left a distinct cultural impact, which we still notice today. But did it have to be like this? What if this famously unwinnable war went differently? Today we will ask, what if South Vietnam won the Vietnam War? Vietnam was colonized in the later half of the 19th century by France, who unified it with a series of protectorates to become the colony of French Indochina. After the fall of France at the hands of the Nazis, the Empire of Japan invaded Indochina and installed Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai into power as a puppet. An anti-Japanese communist resistance known as the Viet Minh rose to power advocating for Vietnam's independence under the nationalist Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, the Vietnamese succeeded against Japan and declared their independence, but the French quickly intervened with the hope to reassert colonial rule. This started the First Indochina War, where the U.S. backed France and Vietnam was backed by the USSR and China. Around this time, the domino theory was created, which believed the political events and changes in one country could expand to their neighbors, this theory being what justified U.S. intervention in Indochina. The Viet Minh were successful in defeating their French colonizers, and in 1954, the Geneva Conference divided Vietnam into a northern communist state based out of Hanoi and a southern anti-communist state based out of Saigon. South Vietnam appointed a politician named Ngo Dinh Diem as prime minister. In 1955, South Vietnam held a rigged referendum in favor of ending their monarchy by a supermajority. Ngo Dinh Diem declared himself the new president and canceled plans for Vietnamese reunification with the North. President Diem was a Roman Catholic, largely influenced by the Catholic ruling class of South Vietnam and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, to implement anti-Buddhist policies. Many dissidents were arrested or executed for opposing the South Vietnamese regime. These tensions would escalate to what was better known as the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War. In 1960, communist forces in South Vietnam unified into the National Liberation Front, also called the Viet Cong. North Vietnam was able to supply them via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a series of tunnels and pathways cutting through Laos and Cambodia. South Vietnam would attempt land reform and development. However, the ruling landlords dissuaded the government from taking this action. Military actions by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam against rural farmers only caused more support for North Vietnam and rising communist sentiments. The U.S., under President John F. Kennedy, began supplying South Vietnam with advisors and equipment. However, rampant corruption and incompetence made this largely irrelevant. In 1963, a successful coup occurred by the AVRN and the CIA, who were able to democratize South Vietnam, however at the cost of instability and making the country far more dependent on the U.S. A year later, the USS Maddox was fired on by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and a few days later, a similar incident occurred. However, this second incident was later proven to be fabricated. This event, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, influenced President Lyndon B. Johnson to begin airstrikes and send troops to Vietnam. Due to a lack of volunteers, the government reinstated a form of conscription known as the draft. Further airstrikes like Operation Rolling Thunder were unsuccessful in shifting the tides of war. Upwards of 200,000 American troops were deployed to South Vietnam by 1965. The war continued, and while the Americans possessed the technological advantage, the Viet Cong knew the land and had large support from the people. In 1968, the North Vietnamese began a large offensive into the south, known as the Tet Offensive. Media coverage from journalists caused President Johnson's popularity to decline, ending his hopes of running for re-election that year. An anti-war movement grew in the U.S., and the truth behind American actions in the war was revealed, which is why it's important to recognize that despite each side claiming to help the people of Vietnam, neither side comes out clean from this war. In 1969, President Richard Nixon, elected on a platform of ending the war in Vietnam, escalated fighting by bombing Cambodia and inadvertently causing a civil war and the rise of a brutal communist movement known as the Khmer Rouge. Controversies about the war continued, with further atrocities revealed and top-secret documents being published in 1971 by the New York Times and the Washington Post. In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords and ended their involvement in the Vietnam War. Just 2 years later, South Vietnam collapsed and Saigon fell. With the war at its end, in 1976 the North and South would be unified, becoming the modern-day Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Across the entire war, the U.S. dropped 7.5 million tons of bombs all over Indochina. That's 3.5 times more than the amount of bombs dropped in World War II. This war deeply scarred the U.S. and led to skepticism and opposition to foreign intervention, which we still see today, with the after effects of the Vietnam War outshining that of any other. What if that changed? What if America and South Vietnam came out of the Vietnam War victorious? Despite military defeats, South Vietnam saw some control and stability under its first president, Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, President Diem is a particularly bad individual, a murderous, corrupt puppet leader propped up by the United States. But after his death in the 1963 coup, South Vietnam saw a series of military dictators and instability, so our first change to this timeline is the survival of President Diem and his government. In this alternate timeline, a previous coup attempt in 1960 sees more success, frightening Diem's government and forcing him to negotiate with military leaders to begin political reform. One such example is the position of state councilor, held by Diem's influential and anti-Buddhist brother. Diem would remove Nu from power, instead appointing him to be ambassador to the United States, a position initially offered to him in our timeline. Without Nu and his wife's direct influence, South Vietnam begins stifling their extreme anti-Buddhist policies. Additionally, members of the AVRN are given seats in the government to oversee decisions. Without Nu's influence, soldiers in the army are promoted based on skill and merit rather than faith. The Buddhist population remains peaceful, and the Buddhist crisis of 1963 never breaks out. With the position of state councilor vacant, President Diem appoints General Nguyen Van Thieu to the position. A loyal general and second president of the country in our timeline, he is able to enact more successful land reform. However, in order to avoid unrest or coup plots, the South Vietnamese use American financial aid to pay back landowners and give titles to local farmers, which incentivizes further agricultural production. Our second change will be to have North Vietnam and China's relations break down earlier, with Ho Chi Minh strongly affirming his support of the Soviet Union over China, especially during the later Sino-Soviet split. As a result, China becomes less interested in supporting Vietnam, which will become more important later. While unrealistic, let's imagine this happens for the sake of the scenario. Now we have to change the military path of the war. In our timeline, the Americans opted for a solely defensive strategy, while strategically bombing Indochina to defeat guerrilla fighters. However, direct military action may have increased America's chances of victory. One such example is that of U.S. General William Westmoreland, who spent several years trying to convince President Johnson to launch an offensive on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but these requests were overlooked. In the Sultanate timeline, we need the U.S. government to take the lead in this war in order to secure its victory. So, how would this play out? In 1967, American forces, with the support of detachments from South Vietnam, South Korea, and Australia, launched an invasion in southeastern Laos. American forces reached the Mekong River and advanced north along the pathways to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Tunnel systems are destroyed while air squadrons firebomb the forces of Laos and destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail under Operation Barrel Roll. The Americans are also able to open a front in the ongoing Laotian Civil War, where support is sent to the Kingdom of Laos. American and South Vietnamese troops secure their positions and begin to see victories against the insurgents. The Chinese move divisions to their southern border in order to intervene should the tides turn. However, begin to put pressure on North Vietnam to call for a ceasefire. In case they need more convincing, the U.S. may resort to drastic measures, such as fracture jaw, the plan to send tactical nuclear weapons to South Vietnam, as well as the proposed bombing of North Vietnam's dikes, which would have flooded large amounts of farmland and drowned thousands of people. With these changes, at some point in 1968, North Vietnam agrees to a ceasefire. Negotiations between the two Vietnams eventually end in a renewal of the 1954 Geneva Accords, with an extended DMZ patrolled largely by American troops. A period of 200 days is established for prisoners of war to be exchanged and for Vietnamese citizens who want to migrate. So the Vietnam War ends similar to the Korean War in our timeline, with Vietnam remaining divided. Just like Korea, both governments promote themselves as the true government of Vietnam while not recognizing each other. The process of bringing U.S. troops home would begin. However, a select amount would remain along the DMZ and help train the AVRN to fight remaining Viet Cong forces. These troops are led by General Creighton Abrams, who advises the AVRN in committing to counterinsurgency tactics and winning hearts and minds. The North Vietnamese would want to continue supplying guerrilla forces in the south. This turns attention to a conflict currently ongoing, the Laotian Civil War. In our timeline, America and South Vietnam supported the Kingdom of Laos in their war with communist forces known as the Pathet Lao. In this timeline, with South Vietnam's independence secured, they take a key role and involvement. It would be clear to both nations that whichever side won this conflict would give them a significant advantage over their rivals. With South Vietnam formally intervening in the Laotian Civil War, they are brutally putting down communist forces to help restore the Kingdom of Laos as a key ally. American forces still in South Vietnam become part of this involvement, while bombing missions over Laos continue, devastating Pathet Lao forces. Since the Pathet Lao only won in our timeline after South Vietnam's collapse and America's withdrawal, I can imagine South Vietnam continuing the conflict until the Kingdom of Laos gains the upper hand. The Soviets put pressure on China for seeming to lose control of Indochina, and thus intervenes again, propping up a rump Pathet Lao state in the north. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Laos returns to power, becoming a key American and South Vietnamese ally. With the Ho Chi Minh Trail out of their control, Viet Cong forces lose their supplies and are forced to plunder the Vietnamese countryside for resources. I can imagine the guerrilla actions of the Viet Cong continuing into the 80s or 90s before fizzling out. Another side effect is the neighboring country of Cambodia, which was never invaded by America and South Vietnam in 1970 like in our timeline. Instead, the existing Khmer Republic survives as a close ally of the United States. While under a harsh military dictatorship, this prevents the horrible regime of the Khmer Rouge from existing, and preventing the Cambodian genocide. I can imagine communist guerrilla forces continuing the fight in the country until eventually being defeated. As a result of all this fighting and expenditure of resources, South Vietnam spends its first few years as a militaristic state. President Diem remains in power in South Vietnam, promoting nationalism and unity in the nation, while creating a cult of personality around himself. Any communist parties or elements are purged, and supporters are arrested in the thousands. Just as in the North, where enemies of the government are sent to re-education camps, media is redirected to do the government's bidding, with newspapers and television spouting anti-communist propaganda. Diem sets up a strong central government in the South, however, eventually dies in the early 1970s. A junta of military leaders takes over the country and places State Councilor General Nguyen Van Thieu in charge. In order to help rebuilding, Thieu accepts large American loans and support in exchange for mild social and land reform. South Vietnam also welcomes economic planners from other countries, as they hope to model their economy off of South Korea and Taiwan to ensure an economic boom. However, the ruling class in the country blocks many attempts to introduce religious freedom, political reform, or anti-corruption laws. Under this rule, ethnic and separatist groups in Vietnam, like the Hmong people and the Khmer Krom, may vie for an autonomy and independence while being supported covertly by North Vietnam. As the 1970s continue, America begins outsourcing their industry to South Vietnam, as well as lowering tariffs on goods from the country. South Vietnam's industry rapidly expands, however, wages are mediocre and workers' rights or unionization are suppressed and deemed communist infiltration. Factories make South Vietnam a center for creating rubber, paper, chemicals, and sugar. This eventually starts up economic recovery, with the country able to begin rebuilding itself after years of conflict. Additionally, South Vietnam lies not too far from large underwater oil reserves, which means that during the oil crises of 1973 and 1979, South Vietnam can expand their production and grow immensely wealthy from it. Since North Vietnamese leadership would move closer to the USSR, China attempts to exert their influence. China's influence on North Vietnam leads to the unsuccessful reforms and a stagnant economy. As a result, China signed several agreements with North Vietnam, forcing the government to import much of their food from China and giving China's Navy access to North Vietnam's maritime territory. As the Cold War progresses, South Vietnam suffers unrest as the people call on the ruling class to hold elections and end military dominance over the state. In the mid-1980s, President Thieu called for the first elections in the country. These elections see a large number of parties running in the legislature, with the Democratic Socialists winning a majority against the incumbent Democratic Progressive Party. Further reforms are pushed through, while South Vietnam's Supreme Court rules in favor of workers and unions against large conglomerates in several court cases. Pressure from the new generations and working classes may escalate to eventually open the path to Vietnamese reunification and democratization. Some of the other changes in this timeline come with the United States. Rewinding back to the 1968 presidential election, the military victories and peace negotiations with Vietnam would be able to keep President LBJ's popularity steadily rising. Richard Nixon doesn't really have a campaign to run on with the Vietnam War practically over. Instead, the Republican nomination is contested between Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan, with Rockefeller eventually securing the nomination, although LBJ likely wins the election and secures his second term. It's hard to tell what this second term would be like, mainly due to the lack of Nixon's presidency, but I can't imagine LBJ continuing the war on poverty, expanding the Great Society programs, and even making advances in proposals like universal health care. Therefore, this changes several presidential elections in the future, with people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan potentially never becoming president, and controversies like the Watergate scandal never happening. The victory in Vietnam will have snuffed out the anti-war and counterculture movement, with much of the U.S. population more nationalistic and pro-war than in our timeline. The United States is much more likely to intervene in conflicts like the Yom Kippur War and the Iran hostage crisis, with the success of South Vietnam and the absence of Vietnam Syndrome giving the U.S. free rein to prop up other anti-communist countries in places like South America and Africa. Other conflicts like the Iran-Iraq War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan may also be drastically changed, but a large amount of differences in the United States are cultural, as even today, the loss in the Vietnam War has left a significant impact. Songs like Man in Black and Fortunate Son would never be written as protests of the Vietnam War. Several movies and TV shows may never exist without the massive psychological damage Vietnam veterans suffered from, or the stories they told. Several million acres of forest and wilderness in Southeast Asia would remain untouched by bombs or chemical weapons, and several million people killed in Cambodia, Laos, or Vietnam would have survived. The future is hard to tell from here. Will Vietnam eventually reunify after decades of division, or will pressure from foreign powers keep the two countries separate? Comment what you guys think will happen down below and what other video ideas you want to see. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.